Hello everyone and welcome back to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. So without further ado, sit back, relax and enjoy. Steve understood that moving into his grandmother's apartment the day after the funeral was not entirely ethical. On the other hand, there was no point in continuing to live in a rented place when he now had his own two-room apartment. He was registered there, which meant it was his legal inheritance. The young man carried a heavy suitcase into the hallway, raised his head, and saw his own reflection in a perfectly clean mirror. The apartment hadn't yet had time to get dusty after his grandmother's cleaning. She had seemed like a sturdy woman despite her advanced age. At 82, she had remained active and seemed indestructible. But life is unpredictable, and now she was gone. Steve looked around. The apartment, familiar to him since childhood, had not changed at all. The same smell of old furniture, the same wallpaper, and the red lampshade on the ceiling. And it seemed to him that even his grandmother was still there, hiding somewhere, waiting for her grandson. "Hello," came a quiet female voice from the room on the right. Steve shuddered, but realized a second later that it was his sister, Nancy. She was also registered in this apartment and had her own keys. The young man looked into the room and saw that she was sitting on the floor in front of an open gym bag, sorting through her belongings. "Nancy, you're quick as usual," Steve smirked. "But I didn't know you had your skis pointed here to move in as soon as possible. This room is mine." She bustled around, pulling Grandma's things out of the dresser and putting in her own. "Aren't you ashamed?" her brother said. "Grandma just died, and you're already dealing with the inheritance stuff?" "Don't you scold me," Nancy said indignantly. "I'm tired of living in rented apartments too. And look at you, you've already arrived with your stuff." "All right, you're right," Steve agreed. "I get it. So we're going to live together again, like in childhood." But his sister did not accept this gesture of reconciliation. She wanted to vent her frustration in a playful quarrel with her brother. "What? Did you think I'd give you my half of the inheritance?" "No, I knew you'd come," Steve admitted honestly. "But I was hoping not so soon. What if I want to bring some girl here?" "Sure, you'll want to," she teased. "But nobody's gonna come to you anyway." "Sarcasm is your specialty," Steve muttered as he left the room and went to get his suitcase. "Once we save up some money, we'll sell this apartment and buy ourselves each a one-bedroom," Nancy shouted from inside the room. "But for now, we'll just have to tolerate each other. We're not kids anymore, we'll get along," Steve answered cheerfully. They didn't look like people in mourning at all. They had already been sad during the funeral rituals. Besides, their grandmother had lived a long and rather good life and had passed away quietly. She lay down for a nap on the couch and never woke up. Of course, the brother and sister felt the emptiness of losing a relative, but now they had found each other again, which helped them not dwell on their grief. The room that went to Steve, like the entire apartment, was the embodiment of an old American past. The walls were covered in floral wallpaper. The floor had brown linoleum with ripples. In the corner stood a huge wardrobe whose door was held by hope alone. Instead of a bed, there was a folding couch, the same one where their grandmother had died. Steve accepted that he would have to sleep on it for a while, at least until they bought new furniture. After he finished unpacking, he went to the kitchen to make some tea. In the corner stood an old refrigerator from decades ago, with a large metal handle made of chrome and rounded dents on the door. At the very top was a note taped on with yellow tape: "After midnight, do not open." While Steve admired this contraption, Nancy came into the kitchen. "What piece of junk," she snorted. Her brother immediately felt like arguing and showing off. "Junk? It's how many years old, and it still works. It outlived Grandma. I wonder if any modern refrigerator will last as long? 10 years, and it ends up in the landfill. It's as loud as a jackhammer next door, Nancy grimaced. We'll get used to it, Steve replied. And our grandma was on a diet, Nancy said, noticing the note. Steve patted the old tape. That's why she was so skinny. She didn't eat at night. We should take her example. Let's keep the note. It'll be the golden rule of our house. Brother and sister cleared out the fridge of stale food and old freezer burn. Then they divided the shelves to keep their groceries separate. Thus began their shared life. The next morning, Steve walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He was lured by the aroma of coffee. Nancy was already sitting at the table, sipping from her mug. Good morning, she said. Morning. Care to share your coffee? Her brother asked. You can take the one in the bag, she answered. I bought you the cheap stuff on purpose so you wouldn't take mine. Thanks, Steve said gratefully. I'll buy something for you too. I don't wake up in the morning without coffee. I had the worst nightmare about our fridge, Nancy said. I still think about it. Was it really just a dream? What was it? Steve asked, sitting down next to her. It's like I woke up in the middle of the night, wanting to munch on something, she began. I remembered you had a piece of sausage somewhere. So I got up and went there, opened the fridge, and there was a pig's head. I thought maybe you put it there, but it was rotten, green, and stinking. I wondered if you'd lost your mind, stuffing rotten meat in there. But then it squealed and started squeaking like a pig. I jumped back and slammed the fridge shut with my foot. Steve stared at his sister in amazement. You won't believe this. What? She asked, turning pale. It must have been a dream for sure. But last night, I woke up to squealing from the kitchen, like a pig, and you yelling something. Don't make stuff up, his sister exclaimed. I swear, Steve insisted, beating his palm on his chest. I'm telling you the truth. They both looked over at the refrigerator, as if expecting to hear more oinking or shrieking from inside. I don't know, Nancy said quietly. You think it wasn't just a dream? And what's up with that note? Steve mused. You're not suggesting something awful happens with this fridge at night, are you? Maybe Grandma's playing jokes on us from the other side, the young man said, attempting to make the situation sound comical. But the thought made him uneasy. That night, Steve tossed and turned on the couch, unable to sleep. The stiff springs dug into his back and sides. There was also the noise of the refrigerator, humming, then shuddering like a dog shaking off water, then falling silent, and then starting to hum again. Those sounds reminded him of hunger. And there was cheese, sausage, toast, and garlic sauce in the fridge, perfect for making sandwiches. Of course, Steve remembered the golden rule, but what do you do when your stomach is growling? He got up and headed to the door. It was cold in the dark hallway. As he approached the kitchen, a sudden wave of dread came over him. He recalled Nancy's nightmare from yesterday. Determined to banish the rising terror, he strode to the fridge and yanked on the chrome handle. And there it was, in the fridge's cold, yellow light, the corpse of his sister. Someone had removed all the shelves and placed her pale, lifeless body inside. Nancy's vacant eyes stared into nowhere. Steve slammed the door shut, plunging back into darkness. He trembled. This can't be real. It can't be real. I imagined it, he told himself. Then he pulled the handle again, and this time he saw his sister's body sliced into pieces, arms, legs, torso, and head separately. Steve couldn't bear it and shut the door again. No, it can't be, he told himself. Once more he opened the door, hoping to see the usual arrangement of sausage, cheese, and milk. The shelves had indeed returned. But instead of the usual groceries, there were carefully cut pieces of his sister's body arranged like steaks. He slammed the door with all his strength, collapsed onto a chair, clutched his head, and let out a scream of horror. Suddenly, the light came on in the kitchen. In the doorway stood Nancy, very much alive, her eyes wide with shock. "Steve, what are you screaming for?" "Nancy, is that you?" her brother cried out. She looked at him in confusion. "Have you lost your mind?" Steve pointed at the fridge, trembling. I saw you inside there, all chopped up." Wanting proof, Nancy said, "Open it." Her brother shook his head. "No. Just open it for a second," she urged. "I want to see." Steve stood and pulled the handle. The chunks of human flesh were gone, but the interior was splattered with blood. Both brother and sister saw it. Nancy recoiled in horror, eyes wide. Steve tried to shut the door, but she said, "Open it again." He obliged. Now it was an ordinary sight: cheese, bread, milk, and everything else, no blood, as if nothing had happened. "What kind of jokes are these?" Nancy asked in surprise. "Maybe we should hang a lock on it?" Steve blurted the first thing that came to mind. "Just don't raid it at night," his sister scolded. "Why'd you come here anyway?" "I got thirsty," he lied, not wanting to admit he wanted to sneak some of her food. "There's water in the tap," she reminded him. "Maybe that'll start running with blood at night," Steve joked darkly. "Stop scaring me," Nancy scolded. "Go to bed." They switched off the light and went back to their rooms. From then on, the kitchen became a no-go zone after midnight. Brother and sister tried to abide by the rule, and over time their nerves settled. After all, Grandma had used that same kitchen appliance for half her life and died at a ripe old age. Nancy began to think it was almost funny, a fridge that tried to scare them with horrific illusions but apparently did no real harm. It was somewhat like the Canterville ghost. One night, Nancy stayed up late working on a presentation for her job. She couldn't delay it any longer. Then fatigue set in, and she decided to perk up with a cup of coffee. She went to the kitchen and boiled the kettle. The fridge rattled and trembled like a living thing, reminding her of a growling dog warning you not to come near. Odd how by day it seemed so harmless. She took a sip of coffee. It tasted bitter and nasty without milk. But the milk was in the fridge, and it was already after midnight. She wasn't supposed to open it. What if I just unplug it, grab the milk, and plug it back in, she wondered. "Listen, fridge," she said under her breath, "don't scare me with your illusions. I'll only bother you for a second. Deal?" She pulled the cord from the outlet. The fridge jerked violently and went quiet. Now its silence felt even more ominous. Nancy thought she might not want coffee after all, but she was determined to see it through. Her thin fingers gripped the chrome handle. She took a deep breath, and inside, there was no light, and there was a boy sitting there in just a t-shirt and underwear, thin and blue from cold. His body was stuffed to the back wall of the fridge, his hair frozen stiff, but he was still alive, chattering his teeth and moaning hoarsely. He looked up at Nancy. The boy pulled his face from the wall, taking some skin with it. "Help me," he pleaded, his eyes full of desperation. He grabbed Nancy's wrist. She felt the icy grip pressing her bones. "Let go, you're hurting me," she cried. The boy was trying to yank himself off the wall, cracking the ice as he moved. Nancy recognized him. She remembered that face from childhood. Wrenching her arm away, she quickly slammed the door shut. At that moment, Steve rushed into the kitchen and grabbed her shoulders. "Nancy, calm down. What happened? He squinted in the bright kitchen light, having just woken up, and run to her. Let's get out of here, she pleaded. He led her to her room. They sat on her bed, and Nancy was shaking, looking at her wrist. What did you see? Steve asked. There was a boy in there, Nancy said. He looked like Arthur Burton, my old classmate. Remember him? That's the one they locked in the janitor's closet, right? Steve recalled. Yes, Nancy confirmed. They bullied him constantly. Steve eyed her warily. And you too? She shook her head. No, but I often think about him, and I can't shake my guilt. Back then, it never seemed like what they did to him was wrong. I didn't sympathize or try to stand up for him. I thought Arthur himself was to blame for not being able to defend himself. Now I remember how cruelly they treated him, and I hate that I was so indifferent when he begged us for help. It seems our fridge is trying to push us with guilt. Nancy, look at your arm, Steve said, touching her wrist. Ouch, it hurts, she winced. The skin there was swollen, bearing bruise marks shaped like fingers. You need ice, he suggested. And where do I get it from? She asked grimly. Right, the fridge, he nodded. So it's not just hallucinations, Steve concluded. We'll get rid of it. We'll buy a new fridge when we get paid. After what happened, I'm not touching it, Nancy insisted, rubbing the bruises on her wrist. I don't get how Grandma lived with that thing all these years. The next night arrived. Steve didn't go to bed until Nancy was already asleep. He felt safer knowing she wouldn't go wandering to the fridge after midnight. But just as he was dozing off, he heard the fridge door open. He jumped up. What's gotten into her? Why does she keep doing this? He thought, rushing to the kitchen to rescue her. Hey, what are you doing here? We had a deal, he called out into the darkness. But Nancy wasn't there. The only light came in a pale yellow strip from the slightly open fridge door. From Nancy's room, he could still hear her breathing softly in her sleep. She hadn't gotten up at all. Could the fridge have opened by itself? Feeling weak in the knees, he stepped into the kitchen, intending to slam the door shut without looking. But then a whisper came from inside. Steve, is that you? Steve, help me. He reached for the handle, about to shove it closed. Help me, please, came the frail voice, choked by the cold. Steve knew that voice, Uncle Gary. Many years ago, when Steve and Nancy were little, Uncle Gary froze to death on New Year's Eve. He went into the woods to cut down a Christmas tree for his beloved niece and nephew, got lost, and died in the cold. Now the refrigerator seemed to have no shelves or back wall, just a lit-up passage into some endless space. Beyond was darkness, snowdrifts, and a raging snowstorm, the very forest where Uncle Gary had perished. I can't get up. I can't feel my legs, the voice whispered from the shadows. Maybe there was still time to save him, to fix it all, to go back there and guide him out of the woods. Mesmerized by the swirling snow, Steve climbed into the fridge, barely aware of what he was doing. A blast of icy wind struck him. Suddenly, someone grabbed the back of his hair and yanked him. What are you doing? Nancy screamed, pulling him backward. Then she used her knee to slam the fridge door shut. Steve shook his head, fighting the mental fog. Uncle Gary was in there calling me. I couldn't stop myself. It felt like I was under a spell. Nancy sat him down on a chair. That's enough. We're not waiting for payday. Tomorrow we'll get rid of it. Agreed, Steve said, still shaken. Suddenly, a third voice, a raspy, old lady voice, spoke up. You'll throw away my fridge? It came from inside. Grandma? Nancy whispered. Neither sibling intended to open the door, but it swung open on its own. The upper freezer compartment cracked off with a snap. Inside lay their Grandma Ellen, twisted up like an inflatable doll, her arms, legs, and head all tangled together. "Are you seeing this?" Steve asked. "I am," Nancy replied. Grandma Ellen was clearly frozen stiff and cramped in the tiny freezer, her dull eyes darting about. Her blue lips moved. "Needed to cool off, get a little break from the heat." "What put you there?" Nancy asked quietly from behind her brother. "No need for you to know my heavy sins," croaked their undead grandmother. Her eyes wandered. "And don't you dare get rid of my fridge. Your grandfather gave his life for it." "What do you mean, gave his life for it?" Steve asked. "Don't talk to her," Nancy hissed, trying to push the door shut again. Their dead grandmother squirmed uncomfortably, crammed in the freezer. He was the one who lugged it up to the 4th floor and slipped on the stairs. That fridge flattened him, smeared him across the floor. "Your mother didn't tell you. But as you see, the fridge still works." "Grandma, forgive us," Steve said, trying to close the door. "You little brat, you'll pay," the old woman shrieked, thrusting out bony hand. "Nancy, help me," Steve yelled, pressing on the door. Their grandmother screeched and thrashed, but at last, the siblings managed to shut it. Steve unplugged the fridge and flipped it on its side, door to the floor. "That's not an appliance. It's a portal to hell," he declared. "Tomorrow, it's gone. I promise." That morning, Steve ordered an inexpensive fridge on an installment plan, then hired a mover to take the old one to the dump. Before long, a truck pulled up outside. A cheerful, round-bellied man with a mustache came up to the apartment with a dolly. "So, how much do we owe you?" Steve asked. "No charge," the man replied. "But we agreed you'd take it to the dump," Steve said. The man grinned. "Why dump such a good fridge?" "It's dangerous," Steve insisted. "Don't worry. Everything will be fine," the mover assured him. Steve waved him off. "Fine, take it. Do whatever you want." He didn't help load the fridge, the man handled it alone, thanked the owners, and disappeared through the door. Steve and Nancy listened tensely to the dolly wheels clanging on each step. Then came the slam of the front door. They relaxed, thinking it was all finally over. Suddenly, a scream came from outside, followed by a heavy thud. Steve and Nancy looked at each other in horror and raced to the balcony. The mover lay pinned under the fridge. It had fallen on him during loading. His face was unmoving, and blood was spreading across the asphalt. The paramedics couldn't save him. That man became the fridge's final victim.